inflation attacks are the most common vulnerability that affects vault systems and really just accounting systems in general. And so today, of course, we're going to go through, first of all, what are inflation attacks? How can they come about? And we're going to talk about the three things that all come into place to yield an inflation attack. And now you can look for those three things when you're looking at other code bases, or perhaps if you're even writing your own DeFi protocol, and see exactly how we can identify inflation attacks. And then we're going to look at two examples of inflation attacks and see that they're not only applicable to specific canonical ERC 4626 vaults or anything like this, and we'll talk about what ERC 4626 is. And then finally, we'll have a look at a couple of solutions for the inflation attack and examine what those look like and what the externalities of those are. So, of course, before we dive in, my name is Owen, and over 2 years ago now, I founded Guardian Audits, and ever since then, our team has covered over 100, perhaps even 200 different high and critical vulnerabilities in security reviews, and through auditing, honestly, over 1,000 different smart contracts, and having spent a couple thousand hours reviewing smart contracts myself, my goal with all of these videos, and especially this one, is to basically distill down all of that experience and give it to you so that you can ultimately become a much stronger blockchain security researcher, blockchain developer, whatever it is you're looking to be, in a fraction of the time. So with all of that out of the way, let's dive in and let's talk about inflation attacks. All right, amazing. So we are going to talk about, first of all, what is an inflation attack? What are the three things that I look for to actually pinpoint an inflation attack and be able to tell if a vault system, or really just any accounting system, is going to be vulnerable to an inflation attack? And then we'll look at some examples, and then finally we will see what are the solutions that we have, what are the trade-offs with all of those solutions. So first of all, to even understand what the inflation attack is, let's go back to the roots, right? Let's just understand, first of all, what are the systems that inflation attacks are affected by, right? So first we need to understand vault systems. So let's have a talk about vaults, right? So what is a vault? Well, first of all, a vault generally, I guess the most abstract definition of what a vault is in, DeFi smart contract concepts is just a smart contract where funds are deposited and then they are managed by the logic of the system. So it's really, if you step back and think about it, it's really an arbitrary, pretty loose definition. A vault is really just a smart contract or a set of smart contracts where you deposit your funds in and you get some receipt token out, and that part is important for this attack. And so to visualize it, we might have our trusty contract here, and we will draw the classic contract rectangle. So this is my smart contract, and let's say this is my vault system, right? So a user will come in and they will deposit their tokens. Let's say this vault system works with, let's say wrapped ether. So let's say I put one wrapped ether into this vault system. I'm going to get a certain amount of shares of the vault token out, and there's going to be some kind of an exchange rate that determines how many of these vault tokens I get. So if I put one wrapped ether into this system, I might get, if the exchange rate is determined to be one wrapped ETH per one vault token, then I will put one wrapped ETH in and I will get one vault token out. And I'm just going to use V to represent the vault token. So this vault token, what is this vault token? It is essentially just an IOU from the vault saying that, hey, I can take this vault token, I can come back to this contract at some point in the future, and I can redeem my one vault token and get my Ethereum out. Now, I might not get exactly one Ethereum though, because this ratio here can change. So I might have deposited, when the ratio was one ether to one vault token, we can say this is, say in block 100, that was the ratio, but the ratio could change. It could be 1.2 ether per one vault token in block 150. So what happened is the ether that was sitting in the vault, it accrued value. Maybe it was being put to work in some yield strategy, something that was earning a yield on the ether that was in that vault. And so now my one vault token is no longer worth just the single Ethereum that I deposited into the vault. Now it's worth 1.2 Ethereum. So I've gotten some yield. And so now when I come back with my vault token, my IOU token, I redeem it and I get the exchange rate for one vault token, which is now 1.2 ether. So I will get 1.2 ether out. And so this pattern is obviously good for being able to combine a bunch of funds and then have some strategies that are, they could be either lending those funds out, they could be putting them into other DeFi protocols, and basically just doing anything to accrue interest, accrue yield on those funds, and account for the yield being distributed to everybody who has contributed to the vault. So multiple people can come and deposit into this vault, and their funds in aggregate can earn yield, and each of those people with their individual vault token shares will gain the correct amount of yield corresponding to how much of the underlying asset they deposited into the vault. So now let's apply this to what are inflation attacks. So inflation attacks really rely on this fundamental thing right here, this exchange rate between the vault token and the underlying asset. And specifically, there are three things that matter surrounding this exchange rate. So we're going to list out all three of these things, and then we're going to have a look at how this can actually manifest itself. So the first most important red flag that you will see in a system that should get you to start thinking about inflation attacks is you want to see balance of used in the accounting. So very commonly, balance of will be used to determine what is the share of one of these vault tokens, because very easily you can just say, okay, what is the balance of this contract in wrapped ether? And then we'll just divide that by the total supply of vault tokens. Boom, there's your ratio. There is the exchange rate from vault tokens to wrapped ether, from wrapped ether to vault tokens. And it's intuitive, and that makes sense, and it's actually a good design, but it is manipulatable. So this is the first red flag that should go off when we see that. Okay, now the second red flag here that we want to be on the lookout for is basically rounding down / precision loss on the vault share calculation. So we will explain more about what this actually looks like when we look in depth into detail, but essentially what we want to see is that when we are computing the amount of vault token shares that somebody gets minted when they're depositing the underlying funds into the system, we are looking for a rounding down precision loss. So what does this look like? So let's imagine I am depositing into this vault system. I'm going to deposit a certain amount of underlying assets. I'm going to get a certain amount of vault tokens based on that. So let's actually write out a formula and visualize, and then we can see what we're talking about with this precision loss. So let's say this vault system, let's say it currently has 100 wrapped ether, and let's say the vault has been doing pretty good. So let's say the vault has, I don't know, let's just go with 50 vault tokens. So we'll do 50 vault tokens and 100 wrapped ether. So the exchange rate is 2 wrapped ether per 1 vault token. And then let's say I want to deposit 50 wrapped ether into the system, and then we need to compute in the smart contract, we need to compute how many shares of the vault token I should get for depositing those 50 wrapped ether. So let's walk through it. So my amount is equal to 25, I think I said 50 wrapped ether, and we already have a total supply for the vault token of 50 V vault token, and then we will have a balance of, so balance of is 100 wrapped ETH. So to convert this amount to a vault token amount, which is what we want to do, then we will basically use this formula here, right? So we want to multiply the amount times the total supply divided by the balance of. So what we're doing here is we're taking the amount and we're basically saying you're going to get as much vault tokens as the amount that you provided times the ratio of the underlying asset to the vault tokens, right? So we're using that exchange rate to convert the amount to a vault token amount. And one thing I do like to do when I'm confronted with formulas, especially as formulas get more and more complex in DeFi systems, in smart contract systems, I like to list out the units of each of these things. So this is a wrapped ether thing. So I'll say this is a wrapped ether amount times something that is a vault amount divided by balance of. So balance of, well, that's the balance of wrapped ether in the system. So this is divided by a wrapped ether amount. And so I can clearly tell that this formula here, what it yields is we have our wrapped ether amount cancels with the balance of, and we get a vault token amount. At least we are getting the expected units. And then I can see that, okay, in terms of the magnitude of what is being returned here, we are getting something that is the amount valued at the ratio of the total supply of vault tokens to the balance of the vault, right? So that's where the exchange rate comes in. So this is the formula that we're going to use to determine how many vault shares you get when you deposit a certain amount of assets. Now, bringing it back to our second red flag, rounding down or precision loss on the vault share calculation. So where do we have rounding down and precision loss? Well, remember, we are using solidity. So we have rounding down precision loss right here, right where we use the division symbol. Of course, since we're using solidity, if this numerator happens to be, let's say, 10,000 and the denominator somehow is 10,001, this in solidity equals 0, right? So this is our precision loss. We have no way to represent decimals in solidity. Now, if you want to understand a bit about decimals more in depth and you want to understand more about specifically rounding errors, then go ahead and check out my video on rounding errors on my channel. Go ahead and put it in the description below. Okay, so we will see how we can use that precision loss in just a second. Now, the third and final red flag that we want to be on the lookout for, the trifecta to complete our list before we can confirm that we do indeed have an inflation attack here. We want to investigate the first depositor logic. So in the vast majority of cases, only going to apply to the first depositor, or really just any depositor before the amount of underlying assets in the system and the amount of vault shares that exist reach a certain threshold. So in most cases, really the first depositor. So what we want to do is we want to look and see if there's any specific special logic for the first depositor. And usually what we'll see is this. So of course, when you are the first depositor, then the balance of this contract would be 0 because nobody has come in and deposited underlying assets. So in a lot of systems, in the vast majority of systems, what will happen is the exchange rate is assumed to be 1-to-1 to begin with. So for every one wrapped ether that you put in, I will give you one vault token when you are the first depositor. And so if the first depositor puts in, let's say, 10 wrapped ether, then they will get initially 10 vault tokens. So there's an assumed 1-to-1 exchange rate between the first deposit, the amount that goes in, and the vault tokens that are received for the first deposit. And specifically, we want to look for and make sure that the protocol isn't making any specific first deposits on the behalf of the users, and it's not doing anything special for the first depositor other than this formula here. So if we have all three of these things in tandem, then there's a very high likelihood that we do indeed have an inflation attack. So now that we understand these three things that we're looking for, let's understand what is the goal of the inflation attack? What does it look like from a high level? And then let's have a look at two examples of the inflation attack in real smart contract systems. So you might have already been able to figure it out just based on the formula that we went through here and the fact that it's going to involve the first depositor. You might have already figured out what the inflation attack aims to do, and you might even understand how it can do it. But let's walk through it step by step here. So I'm going to copy this formula and we'll head over here. And essentially the goal of the inflation attack is to abuse this formula and specifically abuse the rounding down effect here of the division symbol in solidity in order to cause whoever is trying to be the first depositor to lose out on vault tokens that they should have been minted, and then the underlying assets that should have gone to minting those vault tokens that are essentially lost due to precision loss are distributed out to the attacker and the first depositor here, or the user. So let's see, what do I mean by that? So let's draw out our classic vault system here. It is perfect rectangle, which is of course how we represent smart contracts. And let's say we have a user, Bob, who comes in, and Bob is the first user of this vault system, right? He has submitted a transaction to the mempool to be the first depositor. He thinks he's going to be the first depositor, and he is depositing, of course, 1 wrapped ether, or let's say 10 wrapped ether. And of course, this vault accepts wrapped ether and it issues vault tokens. We're going to use the same V token. So if Bob's transaction here would have gone through, then he will receive back 10 V tokens because the initial exchange rate is 1 wrapped ETH per 1 vault token. That is the initial exchange rate before there's any funds in the system, before any vault tokens exist. But what's going to happen is we are going to see Bob get front run. So instead of Bob being the first user to get in the vault here, actually Alice, devious Alice, is going to observe. She sees Bob's transaction in the mempool and she front runs him and she goes into the vault. And really quickly, if you're not entirely familiar with front running, then go ahead and check out my front running video. It explains everything there is to know about front running that you need to know in terms of what Alice is doing here, and that will also be in the description below. So Alice front runs Bob, and let's say Alice, instead of depositing 10 wrapped ether or even just 1 wrapped ether, she deposits 1 way of wrapped ether. So of course, if you're unfamiliar with what 1 way is, then you can check out my rounding issues video, which is in the description, which will go through and explain what a singular way is. But Alice deposits 1 way of wrapped ether. And so with this 1 wrapped ether per 1 vault token exchange rate, Alice is going to get out. We'll just move Bob down. She's going to receive out of this a corresponding amount of vault tokens. She's going to get 1 way of vault tokens based on this. And now importantly, the total supply, so remember the total supply is used in this formula right up above here. The total supply now equals 1 way, right? Because we've minted to Alice the first of the vault tokens, a single way of the vault tokens now exists. Before Alice's transaction, the total supply was 0. Now it is 1 way. So now Alice has received her vault tokens, but she's not done just yet. Now what she does is something particularly devious, and it almost seems contradictory. It seems counterintuitive. But here's what she's going to do. She's going to send directly to the contract wrapped ether. So she only put in 1 way of wrapped ether, and she actually called the deposit function. But now instead of calling the deposit function to deposit this additional amount of wrapped ether, she's going to transfer it to this contract address directly. So we will continue to move Bob's transaction down here, and Alice is going to do 1 more interaction, and she's going to transfer. So Alice transfers in 10 wrapped ether, and she doesn't receive any vault tokens or get any remuneration for doing this immediately because she didn't call the deposit function, right? So she's not going to get minted any vault tokens, but she did increase the balance of this contract. So really quickly, what is the state of the system here? So the total supply that we had here, that didn't change. It's still at 1 way. But now the balance of this contract is 10 wrapped ETH and a single way. So if we put the decimal there, then we've got technically 18 zeros. So I guess I will put all of those. So 17 zeros followed by a single way. So 1 right there. And then I'm going to just leave this decimal place. Of course, we know that in Solidity, there is no such thing as a decimal place, but just for the ease of representation, I'm going to leave this in there. So this is the balance of. Now, finally, after Alice is done with all of these actions, now Bob is finally going to have his deposit executed. And so how many vault token shares is Bob going to get? Let's have a look and let's walk through it. So we're going to use this formula that we've got right here, amount times total supply divided by balance of. So let's walk through it. We've got 10 wrapped ether times the total supply, which remember is one way, so literally times 1 with no zeros after it, divided by 10 wrapped ether plus a singular way. So I'm going to do 10 wrapped ether plus 1, and that will basically just represent this right here. And so, of course, what does this equal in solidity? We basically have 10 wrapped ether. We can remove this times 1. 10 wrapped ether divided by 10 wrapped ether plus 1. Well, of course, in solidity, with rounding errors and precision loss and truncation, this is equal to 0. So Bob has received 0 vault tokens, even though he deposited 10 wrapped ether. And now, remember that we can come back to the vault and we can redeem our vault tokens, right? So Alice is the only person who has any vault tokens. She has one way of vault tokens. So Alice can come back and redeem her singular way of vault tokens. So one way of V, and we will compute how much Alice should be able to withdraw with essentially the inverse of this equation. So instead of this amount being a wrapped ether amount, this is a vault token amount. And then instead of multiplying by total supply, we multiply by balance of, and we divide by total supply. And so, of course, if we work through the units, we have vault token times wrapped ether divided by vault token, and we end up with wrapped ether. So we can actually walk through this with our one way of vault token shares times the balance of this contract, which is the 10 and 1 ether, 10 and 1 way of wrapped ether that was originally sent, plus Bob's 10 wrapped ETH that he sent in without getting any vault tokens minted to him. And this is going to be one way times 20 wrapped ETH, technically plus 1, literally one way. So I'll put this in parentheses, divided by the total supply. And remember, Bob didn't get minted any new vault tokens. So the total supply is, of course, still one way. So of course, what is this equal to? Well, it's equal to roughly 20 wrapped ether. And then of course it has the extra way. So 20 wrapped ether and one way. So this is what Alice gets to withdraw. But remember, what Alice put in was just 10 wrapped ETH, and she also put in a single way. So she pretty much roughly doubled the amount of wrapped ether that she was able to withdraw in this circumstance. And of course, at the expense of Bob, she essentially just stole all of Bob's wrapped ether here. And so this is the crux of the inflation attack. So let's have a look at some examples of the inflation attack and see what it actually looks like in smart contract code. And then we'll have a look at some of the solutions. So first of all, I've got a old version of a Beefy Finance vault here. So this is the Beefy Vault V5, which is now 2 years old, which is crazy to think about. This is when I was just getting into researching DeFi protocols and DeFi smart contracts and stuff like this. The Beefy Vault V5, I remember studying this contract and thinking it was so cool and completely not even realizing that this was a vulnerability. But let's walk through and see how this vulnerability exists in this deposit function. So let's go ahead and walk through our 3 things here. So first of all, balance of in the accounting here. So we can identify that, first of all, our formula of amount times total supply divided by balance of, well, that rings true here. We can see we have on line 112, the amount, which is a underlying asset amount, times the total supply, which is a vault token amount. In fact, it's the total supply of vault tokens divided by the underscore pool, which is the result of this balance function. So let's find this balance function. Okay, cool. So this is token.balance of this address plus, some stuff in a strategy address, which is basically an address that is used to earn yields and deposit funds into other protocols and stuff like that. But we're not going to have a look at the strategy. The important part is, hey, there's at the very least, we're using the balance of this address. So it is manipulatable, right? Immediately, whenever you see balance of being used in an accounting system, huge red flag, that can be manipulated by having an attacker just send funds directly to this contract. So our first red flag here is check. Let's have a look now, rounding down and precision loss on the vault share calculation. So rounding down, we are using, since this is so old, we are using safe math. Now, of course, .div still has the same rounding issues as just normal division in Solidity. So yes, our second red flag here, check. Now, first depositor logic, do we have this initial case where if there is no depositor, then there's just a 1-to-1 ratio? Well, that's exactly what this is. We're saying, hey, if you're the first depositor, if total supply is 0, nobody's minted before this, then we're just going to give you the amount of vault shares as the amount that you specified. So I'm completely free to come in here and specify an amount of a single way and mint a single way of vault shares and then set somebody up to perfectly be a victim of the first depositor attack, right? And the reason we really want to be able to mint just a single way here is because the whole strategy of the first depositor attack, this total supply, it has to be as small as possible, because the minute this is something that is, 1 order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude, then it's going to drastically make this rounding and precision loss harder and harder to create, right? Because you're going to have to transfer more and more tokens to the contract to be able to get this denominator big enough to be able to cause significant rounding and precision loss in the numerator. So we absolutely need total supply to be as small as possible. So with that, our number 3, we have that first depositor logic, and also there's no special handling for this case, right? We don't see any special like initial protocol deposit or anything like this. So we are good to go. We have a first depositor attack here. So we could literally use the exact same scenario here that we walked through. It applies to this contract. And this is actually essentially an ERC 4626 vault. This is the ERC 4626 pattern really distilled down at its core. Now, of course, this isn't completely compliant with the full ERC 4626 specification. There's no like mint and redeem functions, but really this is the core. And really, I would say these 4 or so lines here, this is the core of what ERC 4626 is. So if you don't know what ERC 4626 is, it is a standard for using these vaults and issuing vault tokens to be able to give people slices of a pot of assets that are gaining interest, right? So exactly what we talked about with vaults. And it is titled, as we can see here, the tokenized vault standard. And that is exactly what we are doing here in this deposit function, right? We are minting to the message sender a certain amount of shares that is dependent on this formula here. And of course, this vault contract is itself an ERC20 token, right? So this is the ERC 4626 idea. Now, this isn't completely following the official standard, and of course it's not implementing from the Open Zeppelin ERC 4626 contract, because of course this did not exist. This hadn't been made for probably a year and a half or even 2 years when the Beefy Vault V5 was made. So this is kind of like an OG version of the ERC 4626 vault. So that is really the canonical application of this inflation attack and how it applies to ERC 4626 like vaults. So vaults that are basically just similar to the ERC 4626 standard, vaults that look like that, vaults that really have these if and else and mint right here. A lot of vaults you'll see really look like that, where they just have this case: if the total supply is 0, then we have a 1-for-1, and then else we have a conversion based on the total supply comparatively to the vault of the pool, the balance of the vault, really. And you'll see this in a lot of systems, and they might not look exactly like an ERC 4626 vault, but they can still be vulnerable to the inflation attack. So let's have a look at a system that doesn't exactly look like this, but is still very much vulnerable to a inflation donation attack. Okay, so here I have pulled up the Kelp protocol, and this was actually a recent Code Arena contest. And so it goes to show you that this inflation attack, it really is a real finding that comes up pretty often, and it affects real protocols in real contests, right? So let's see, how does the inflation attack come and apply to this Kelp protocol? And specifically, we're going to be looking at the LRT deposit pool. So I've got the LRT deposit pool pulled up here. I'm just going to go ahead and minimize everything so we don't get distracted by all the other logic here. and we can focus in on exactly what's important. And so I'm going to find the deposit asset function, and we will open this up, and we'll see how this is going to be very different from what we just saw with the Beefy Finance Vault V5, but it's in other sense going to be very similar. Now, just to give some background on what is happening in this protocol, even though it's not too important, but just to have it, is essentially what we're doing is we're taking in some liquid staked tokens. So we're taking in like Rocket ETH or like Lido staked ETH, or any of these liquid staked Ethereum derivatives, and then we are depositing them into this big pool, and then they're going to do other things with them once they're in this pool. But essentially, from a high level, this is the same idea of it's a vault pattern, right? You are depositing your liquid staked ETH into this pool, and we are going to issue to you a vault token. Now, they don't explicitly call it a vault token here. They call it RS ETH, but it is essentially just a vault token, right? So when you receive RS ETH, it is essentially an IOU to be able to come back to this pool and withdraw RS ETH presumably later. And so really the interesting bit that we want to get to is when they're determining how much RS ETH to mint, right? And that was exactly the same logic that we wanted to focus in on with the Beefy Vault V5, is in the deposit function where we're determining the shares to mint, right? So anytime you're looking for an inflation attack, that's where you want to pinpoint. Where is the logic that determines how many shares to mint, and does it have those three characteristics that we described? So does it rely on balance of? Do we have rounding down and precision loss? And is there any specific first depositor handling logic? Do we have that exchange rate of 1-to-1 initially, et cetera, et cetera? So let's go into this underscore mint RS ETH function, because it looks like that's pretty much how we determine how much to mint, and it looks like it's also where the minting happens. So let's go into this function, and we can see that there's yet again another internal function that will determine how much to mint, and then we actually do the minting right here. We are specifically interested in how they determine that amount, so let's go in here. And so here's the interesting function, get RS ETH amount to mint. So we're doing something a little bit different, and that's why it's not always directly straightforward, like, oh, that's an inflation attack, but the principles, those three underlying things will still apply. So let's have a look. When we're calculating the RS ETH amount to mint, we're taking the amount, which is an amount of like our Lido staked ETH, and we are multiplying it by the price of this asset. So we're getting the Oracle price, and this is going to be a price in terms of Ether. So how much Ether is this Lido staked ETH or whatever asset worth? And then we're going to divide by the RS ETH price, which is also a price denominated in Ether. So especially when it comes to new formulas, we're going to use our same trick. We're going to go and let us write out the formulas of this thing, or have examine the units. So we're going to, first of all, let me just copy and paste this so we can use this in our whiteboard, and I will remove that, remove this. Okay, cool. So let's examine first of all the units. So let's just put SETH here just to represent our staked ETH amount. So amount is a staked ETH thing, and then we're getting the asset price. So what is a price? Well, it is, if we're talking about a US dollar price, like what is the price of Bitcoin? It is dollars divided by Bitcoin, dollars per Bitcoin. How much dollars do I have to give you for you to give me 1 Bitcoin? So when we're talking about this and it's a price denominated in Ether, we are talking about ETH per SETH. That is the price that we're using. So I'm just going to put that in parentheses just to be clear. That is our numerator here. And then now let's put in this get RS ETH price. So again, this is going to be ETH per RS ETH, which is really our vault token. So really, actually, it might be more helpful to just write this out. So if I have my SETH, and you guys are gonna have to bear with me on my handwriting here. So I've got my SETH times the price here, which is ETH per SETH, divided by the price of RS ETH, which is of course ETH per RS ETH. And I'm just gonna copy this and throw an R in front of it. We'll just put our R right here. So let's do some quick algebra here. So this is going to be equivalent to me taking this here, this, and then multiplying it by the inverse of the denominator. So we're going to take RS ETH. Let me see if I can grab as much of that as possible. That didn't really work out. So I'll just do RS ETH per ETH. Okay, so we've got this formula written out here. So now let us divide things off. So first of all, I can see that we've got an ETH being multiplied over here and ETH being divided over here. So ETH times 1 over ETH, that is going to cancel. So our Ether amounts cancel. And then we've got staked ETH divided by, or times 1 divided by staked ETH. So these are going to cancel. And the units we end up with, the winner is RS ETH. So we're getting RS ETH out of this thing. So yes, indeed, this formula makes sense. So now we have, sort of played with this formula a little bit. We understand what it's doing. It is indeed giving us an RS ETH amount out, which is what we want to get. That's the vault token. That is, how many shares we own of this pool of staked Ether. Now let's look a little bit deeper into this get RS ETH price, because this right here is telling us essentially what is the balance of this system, right? So when we had this beefy logic here, it was a lot simpler. But when you talk about a price, it's like saying, well, what is the cost of one of these vault tokens, right? And well, the cost is based on the balance backing one of those vault tokens. So in Beefy, it was very clear, it's very obvious. The price in Beefy is just the total supply divided by the pool. And really, that's exactly what is happening here. We just have to simplify this formula a little bit and make it a little bit more clear. So instead of having amount times get asset price, let's just change up the way we're thinking about this a little bit. And let's make it a lot more conducive to our previous experience with Beefy Finance and a vault system like that. So our amount times get asset price, well, really that's just a way of valuing what you've deposited in terms of Ether. So we're going to abstract away all of the converting stuff to Ether, and let's just say, okay, we have an Ether value, Ether amount that we're depositing. Now we don't have to worry about that price or anything like that. And we're dividing by get RS ETH price. Well, what is RS ETH price? It is dollars, or in this case, Ether per RS ETH, and we're dividing by that. So if we switch those, because this is currently in the denominator, then we are multiplying by RS ETH per Ether. So this is like the times, we could say the RS ETH supply divided by the total balance of Ether, right? Do you see how right here we've got this conversion rate? This is the inverse of the price, right? So the price is Ether per supply. Now we've inverted that because this was in the denominator, the price was in the denominator. So we flip that and we get supply per Ether. And so this is the same formula, right? We've got Ether amount times total supply divided by total balance. If we go back up here, amount times total supply divided by total balance. So what do we have? Well, we haven't actually looked at the straight up formula where this gets computed, but let's go ahead, and we are hopefully very close to seeing that we indeed have all three of these necessary characteristics. So let's go into, we're interested in the RS ETH price function, because this is what's determining how much of the RS ETH amount you're going to get minted depending on how much Ether value you're depositing into the system. So let's go to this get RS ETH function. Okay, so we're in their LRT Oracle contract and we found the get RS ETH price function, and there's a little bit going on here. It's not nearly as straightforward as we saw in our first example, but we can see the first of these things is if the RS ETH supply is 0, then we return 1 Ether. What is that saying? Well, that is a 1-to-1 exchange rate. So we have our first thing checked off here. We've got that first depositor logic, and we can look around. I don't see any other handling for the first deposit. The protocol is not making that first deposit or anything like this. So there's our first piece checked off. So let's go and let's look for balance of. So to find the balance of, let's look and see a little bit of what is going on in this function. We can see we're looping through the supported assets for the pool. So this pool is a little bit different in that it supports multiple assets to be in the pool that you would own a portion of. Now, we don't have to pay attention to that, and let's focus in on this line here, which essentially decides what the ultimate price will be. So the ultimate price is the total ETH in the pool divided by the RS ETH supply, right? And this is our price, how much ETH per RS ETH. So the RS ETH supply is already determined up here. We're interested in how do you compute the total ETH in the pool? And so to answer that question, we want to have a look at the asset amount. So what we're doing here is we're getting the asset amount. So if this is, say, if the asset is staked ether, we're getting, okay, how much staked ether does this contract hold? And then we're saying, okay, what is the worth of that staked ether in terms of regular ether, and adding that to the total ETH in the pool. So it comes down to this question: how much staked ether is in the pool? So let's go back over to the LRT deposit pool and let's check out this get total asset deposits function. We've got that function right here, and we're going to go to yet another function called get asset distribution data. So it's not straightforward. They're making us work for it, but let's see. So we're going to, first of all, boom, the smoking gun. On line 79, we see a balance of being used to get the asset lying in deposit pool. And this is, of course, the first thing returned from this function. So we don't need to look at anything else in this function. All that's happening here is we're calculating the funds that are deployed elsewhere. But even after we've just gotten a singular balance of being used, we know ultimately, boom, this is manipulatable. So we have this checked off. We're using balance of and we're letting that affect the accounting. So if we go back to where this function was called, we see we return this asset lying in deposit pool, the amount of assets in this contract, which they account for by using balance of. That is a part of the summation, which is returned from get total asset deposits. So this get total asset deposits will go back to the Oracle, and we see this function, get total asset deposits, is what is returned here, which is ultimately affecting the total ETH in the pool, which is ultimately changing the price of the pool, the price of the RS ETH token, which if we go back over to the deposit pool, we see where we're using this get RS ETH price. It is, of course, when we are getting an amount to mint. So this RS ETH amount to mint is directly dependent on the price, which is manipulatable via balance of. So we've gotten this checked off. So finally, rounding down in precision loss on the vault share calculation. So here we're calculating the RS ETH amount to mint. How can we get some sort of precision loss there to make the first depositor lose their shares? Well, right here we have a division symbol. So if we deposit and we just directly transfer a ton of staked ETH or something to this contract to inflate the price of RS ETH, right? So we increase the amount of ETH in the system, the amount of RS ETH stays the same. We inflate the price of RS ETH, meaning that the denominator gets bigger. Meanwhile, this numerator didn't get bigger, and so we can go ahead and cause some precision loss with this division symbol right here. So this is checked off, and we have our three things to cause the inflation attack in the system. And as we can see, this is by no means a canonical ERC 4626 vault implementation. It's not even really purporting to be necessarily a vault, but that's what it is. It is a vault system with these accountings, and it's using balance of. It has this round down precision loss, and it's got that first depositor logic. So this system is vulnerable to the inflation attack. So what exactly would that attack look like? Well, I would see the first person, let's say Bob, trying to come and deposit assets, and maybe they're depositing staked ETH, maybe they're depositing 10 staked ETH, right? And I would front run that transaction. I would be the first depositor. I would provide a single way of staked ETH. And actually, just a side note, I believe it's technically ST ETH, but whatever. So I'm going to deposit a single way, and let's just walk through. You're going to transfer a single way from me. You're going to get a single way. Now, how much RS ETH am I going to get? Well, we're going to go in here, and then ultimately we're going to go to the Oracle. Let's just say that this amount is a single way of Ether or what have you, and the price returned from the Oracle. Well, we're not going to do all of this because now I'm the first depositor. I'm giving you a single way. This is your first single way. So we give you a price of 1 Ether, which is just 1 for 1. And then what happens is this amount in the numerator will be 1E18. This price will be 1E18. And so it settles on 1 way to return from this amount to mint. So I'll be minted 1 way of RS ETH. Now, finally, when Bob actually has his deposit executed, we go to the deposit asset function. And so remember, he's depositing 10 staked ETH into the system. So we'll transfer from his staked ETH, we'll go mint RS ETH. And when we calculate the RS ETH amount to mint for Bob, we're going to come into the Oracle, right? Let's just say his amount here, let's just say that's worth 10 ETH. And let's go to the get RS ETH price function. And we can see now we bypass this since Alice has already minted her single way. And we come in here, we go through the loop, and we get the total asset amount. Now, before Bob's transaction, Alice was super devious, and what she did is she transferred directly to the LRT deposit pool. She transferred 10 staked ETH independently of depositing directly through the contract. So what happens when we call this get total asset deposits function is we go into the LRT deposit pool, and this asset lying in deposit pool, if we go into this get asset distribution data, this is dependent on the balance of, right? So what's the balance of? Well, it's 10 staked ETH and a singular way. So when we come back to the Oracle, this total asset amount, let's say that just translates to the total ETH in the pool being 10 ETH and a single way. The price of this thing is going to be 10 staked ETH, so well, just 10 ETH and a single way divided by the RS ETH supply, which is a singular way. So the overall returned value from this price function is 10E18 plus 1 way. So let's go back to the LRT deposit pool where we're determining how many assets to mint for Bob, and we are dividing his numerator, 10 staked ETH, or just 10 ETH here, divided by 10 ETH plus 1 way. What does that equal? Well, it equals, with division truncation, 0. And so in this case, Bob loses. He doesn't get any RS ETH, but he still transfers to the system his 10 staked ETH that he was going to deposit. And so in this case, we have the exact same scenario play out where Alice is making off with all of Bob's deposited funds. So this exact scenario plays out. Okay, so we've seen what the inflation attack is, the 3 things we need to look for. We've seen 2 examples. Now let's talk about some solutions. So first of all, what the protocol could do is on the behalf of the users for the protection of the first depositor is the protocol could make the first deposit itself. So that would look like in the constructor setting aside, pretty much a trivial amount of initial tokens to deposit so that this initial case, really it's in avoidance of this initial case here, where the attacker is able to set the initial exchange rate and make the total supply one singular way, right? That is the crux of the issue here, is that the attacker can set that the total supply is one singular way, which allows for that rounding loss in precision, because the numerator here, and I suppose really it's not so clear in this, but the denominator here is not so big. In fact, it's literally a single way, so that this price can be big enough to go ahead and round down the amount that you're depositing, right? And the same in the beefy scenario. The crux of the issue is allowing the attacker to set the total supply to be a one singular way, so that when we multiply the amount by one singular way, it is extremely prone to being rounded to 0 or just having a significant amount rounded off by way of this pool amount here. causing some truncation issues. And so that is the first solution, is to have the protocol deposit some of that underlying asset initially. So the total supply can never be a single way or a handful of way or anything like that, so that ultimately users are not really prone to any economically viable form of the inflation attack, because it would require a ton of tokens to transfer to the pool, really an unrealistic amount of tokens to be able to cause an inflation attack on a pool that has even just one vault token as a total supply. And I mean one vault token with, the 18 decimals or however many decimals a vault token has, because that would be like 18 decimals, an 18 decimal amount times an 18 decimal amount for the amount. And then you're not going to divide that by like a 36 decimal thing. So that is how it becomes financially unreasonable to pull off the attack once there's that initial deposit. So the next solution, and this is the more interesting one and a little bit cooler to work through and understand, is by Open Zeppelin, of course. And so they recently came out with the ERC 4626 contract, and this is pretty much probably the best way to just avoid the inflation attack, is to just use Open Zeppelin and use some of the controls that they have here. So first of all, they implemented a solution that makes the attack unprofitable, and then they gave you the knobs to be able to make this attack increasingly unreasonable to pull off. So let's have a look at what they've changed here. So the crux of the change by Open Zeppelin here is in these convert to shares and convert to assets function, right? And that makes sense because every time we were discovering this vulnerability, that's exactly the area of logic that we looked at to see if we had those three things and to see if we could manipulate it in the way that we wanted to. Well, Open Zeppelin has an answer in exactly that part of the logic. So we'll notice that we still have the same general idea of taking an assets amount, multiplying it by the total supply amount, and then dividing it by the total assets, right? This is the same formula that we've been talking about. And of course, we have the inverse for the convert to assets function, where it's just a shares amount times total assets divided by total supply. But you'll notice there's a slight difference here, where we have a shift. We have added a decimal offset, right? So there's this 10 to the power of the decimal offset. Now, by default, the decimal offset is 0. So we'll just talk about this being plus 1. So 10 to the 0 is 1, so plus 1, and then we can talk about when the decimal offset is greater than 0 after we understand the most basic case. So we've added a plus 1 in the numerator here, and we've added a plus 1 in the denominator. And so surprisingly, literally just doing this small change here, plus 1 numerator, plus 1 in denominator, it makes it unprofitable for the attacker to ever pull off the inflation attack. And to see this, let's walk through an example and let's see this happening in real time. So let's take our example that we used here and let's walk through it. So initially, the conversion rate still is 1-to-1, and Alice is, she's front running Bob. She deposits one way, she gets one way of vault tokens out, and then she transfers 10 wrapped ether into the contract. Now Bob comes along, he deposits his 10 wrapped ether, and let's go ahead and we can calculate just to be sure, what does Bob get out of this 10 wrapped ether? So we'll come back to the Open Zeppelin contract. We do assets, so that's his 10 wrapped ether times the total supply, which is one way plus one way. So now he's got 20 E18 in the numerator here, divided by the total assets here, which is 10 ether and 2-way. So let's go ahead and write it out. So here in our updated case, Bob puts in 10 wrapped ether. He multiplies by the total supply plus 1, so that is 2, divided by the total assets plus 1, so that is 10 wrapped ETH plus 2-way, and I'll just put that in parentheses to be clear. And of course, what is this equal to in solidity? Well, it's equal to 1. So instead of getting 0 vault tokens now Bob gets at least 1 way of vault tokens. So now let's keep track of how much vault tokens everybody has. So this is Bob. Bob has 1 way of vault tokens. And here's Alice. Alice also has 1 way of vault tokens. And then what is the total value in the system? Well, it is roughly, so it's going to be 20 wrapped ether. So the 10 that Alice transfer directly in, the 10 that Bob deposited, plus the 1 way that Alice initially deposited. So now if Alice goes to withdraw, she's actually only going to get back out pretty much just 10 wrapped ether. And then Bob also is going to be able to get out 10 wrapped ether. And you can try this out for yourself. You can work through all different kinds of examples, and there's actually no way that Alice can end up being profitable through the inflation attack because of this. Now, that's not to say that Alice can't cause, in some scenarios, Bob's token amount to round down to 0, but it is much harder for Alice to do that. And when his token amount does round down to 0, Alice is not the sole owner of the vault shares, because technically there is this total assets plus 1, this total supply plus 1. Technically, what that means from an abstract sense is that the vault has a piece of the shares itself that it will always hold on to. And effectively what that means is Alice will never be able to walk away with all the funds in the vault. And so she can actually never make a complete profit from the inflation attack. She'll never make a profit. It will always be break even at best, and in most cases it will be a loss. And Open Zeppelin has actually done, they've got a full page right here. We can see a full page detailing the inflation attack, and they have some visualizations with graphs and exchange rates and manipulations and stuff like this. And then they talk about their solution, and you can see all sorts of different examples with this virtual offset. So now that we see that this offset of adding 1 in the numerator, adding 1 in the denominator prevents the attack from being profitable, let's talk about making the attack increasingly hard to pull off to even grief the other user. So while it's not profitable, you can still grief the other user, and you can make Bob end up with 0 if you transfer enough funds to the contract. So for example, in this case, Alice would have had to send 20 wrapped ether into the contract, and that would be able to get Bob to round down to 0. But then, of course, what happens is when Alice goes to withdraw with this convert to assets, she goes and she takes shares times total assets plus 1. So 1 way of shares times total assets, so 20 wrapped ETH plus 1, divided by the total supply plus 1, which is 2. So you've got that plus 1 for the virtual vault token shares. And finally, we get 20 wrapped ether plus 1 way divided by 2. Alice gets out about, pretty much we can assume that 1 way divided by 2 rounds to 0. So basically 10 wrapped ether out. So Alice actually put in 20 wrapped ether. She lost 10 of that wrapped ether because of the virtual vault token shares. Now, even though Alice lost 10 wrapped ether to be able to pull off this attack, she still griefed Bob, right? Griefing is still an attack vector, right? This still caused a harm to Bob, even though it was, not really profitable for Alice. She could still do it, but we can make it increasingly hard for Alice to do that. She would have to spend even more and more money to make that happen. And the way we address that is we increase the decimal offset. So this was with a decimal offset of 0. Well, if we increase the decimal offset to, let's say, 2, so instead of adding 1 in the numerator here to convert to shares, we're going to add 100. Let's have a look at what that does. So this would be 10 wrapped ETH times the total supply, 1, plus the decimal offset, which is 100. And now even if Alice sends in 20 wrapped ether, then Bob still gets. So 10 wrapped ether times 100, that is 1,000 divided by 20. So it's going to be about 50 vault tokens. There's, of course, this 2-way here. I'm just going to ignore that. But the point is, Bob wasn't able to get rounded to 0, even with Alice depositing 20 wrapped ether. Now, to get Bob to round down to 0, Alice would in fact have to send in basically 1,000 wrapped ether. So you can see how we went exponentially more. I don't think anybody is going to spend 1,000 wrapped ether to cause somebody else to lose just 10 wrapped ether. I don't have any enemies that I would do that for. So we can see how this decimal offset makes the attack significantly, first of all, unprofitable, but now not only unprofitable, but extremely costly to even just do a griefing attack. And when we do add this decimal offset, of course, we're going to end up giving people 100 extra, so 100x, or not 100x, but 100 times So 2 extra decimal spots for all their tokens. So what OpenZeppeLin says is, well, this is just going to be defined as extra granularity on the number of decimals for the token. So it's not that Bob deposits 10 wrapped ether and then, in a normal situation, what would happen is this would just be 2, and then Bob would receive 50 E18, actually it would be 500 E18 vault tokens. Now, instead of him technically getting 500 vault tokens, this is actually just 5 vault tokens, because remember the decimal offset is 2. When we go to the underscore decimals function, we see that the decimals of the vault token is the underlying amount of decimals plus the decimals offset. So they're just specifying that no, if the underlying asset has 18 decimals and we have a decimal offset of 2, that's just extra granularity. We're not saying you actually get that much more vault tokens. Our definition of one vault token is not one vault token equals 1E18. We're saying one vault token is a 1E20 thing. So adding those 2 extra amount of decimals for granularity. So really, Bob got, by this definition, he got 5 vault tokens, right? So this would be 5E20 here, which is 5 vault tokens, with the definition that a vault token has 20 decimals. So that is everything there is to know about inflation attacks, first depositor attacks, donation attacks, whatever name you want to call it. This is exactly everything that you need to know about that attack. And it's exactly how you can go and spot it in other DeFi systems, how you can prevent it in DeFi systems. Those are the 2 solutions to that problem. We talked about the 3 red flags for uncovering that problem. And really, this is just the ultimate guide to inflation attacks. There is nothing else that you need to go through to understand inflation attacks at a deep level. So I hope you watch this video back a few times. Make sure that everything clicks along the way, and make sure you can see the vulnerabilities as we go through the examples in real time. And then importantly, go into the contest and try to uncover these for yourself. And that's it. It's really up to you to get in there and get your hands dirty. So I hope that has been helpful for you, and I hope that you can go ahead and use that information in the near future. And of course, if you're looking to become a senior smart contract security researcher, you want to become a experienced security researcher in a matter of months instead of a couple of years. And of course, I have a 6-step guide for you to achieve that and to get there in the description below. That's right there for you if that's what you're looking to do. And then of course, if you're looking for a community of smart contract security researchers, you're really interested in this security thing, and you want to connect with others around the world who are also studying and learning how to become a security researcher, then you can go ahead and join our free community, absolutely free community, at lab.guardianaudits.com. You can fill out an application and get accepted to join the community. So that is everything for today, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one.